A McDonald's that fed a neighborhood for 30 years just shut its doors in California. And the reason wasn't bad business in the normal sense. It wasn't empty parking lots. It wasn't a sudden scandal. It was something colder than that math. The owner didn't blame customers, he blamed the economics. And if that sounds like a local story, it's not, because when the lowest cost food in America starts becoming unaffordable, the ripple isn't cultural. It's structural. This is the kind of shift that doesn't stay inside one state. It spreads. Here's the unsettling part. The fast food industry isn't supposed to be fragile. It's designed to survive recessions, inflation, and changing consumer habits. It's built on speed, scale, and predictable margins. So when restaurants that have survived decades suddenly say we can't make it work anymore, you're not watching a business trend. You're watching an economic signal, and right now, that signal is flashing across California louder than most politicians are willing to admit. California, under Gavin Newsom, is becoming the place where big policy ideas collide with the real world, where the promises sound compassionate and the outcomes look complicated. And before anyone twists this into a culture war, let's be clear, paying workers more is a serious moral argument. No reasonable person wants workers trapped in poverty wages. The question is not whether workers deserve better. The question is whether the system that delivers better can survive the way it's being built. Because if the math breaks, workers don't get higher pay, they get fewer hours, or no jobs at all. And this story isn't about a single burger chain closing, it's about a broader reality check. California raised fast food minimum wages to $20 an hour for large chains. On paper, that looks like progress. In practice, it introduced a pressure test on an industry with already thin margins, rising food costs, rising utility bills, higher insurance, and shifting consumer behavior after the pandemic. It's not one factor, it's convergence. And convergence is what turns reform into disruption. If you want to understand the economy, you have to watch where the pressure breaks first. Fast food is usually the last thing to collapse because it's cheap, essential, and constant. So when the cheapest daily meal starts becoming a luxury for working families, something has shifted in America's cost structure. That's not politics, that's real life. The most revealing thing is how these closures are described. Franchise owners aren't writing angry manifestos. They're writing quiet goodbye notes. Unprecedented changes. Narrowed our path. Gut-wrenching decision. That's the language of someone who tried every lever they could pull: prices, staffing, hours, maintenance, and still couldn't get the business to bounce. That's the story of somebody realizing their business model doesn't work under the new reality. Now let's talk about the wage policy itself. California's $20 minimum wage for fast food applied to chains with 60 or more locations nationally. That's a massive category: McDonald's, Taco Bell, Burger King, Wendy's, Chipotle, and more. Over 500,000 workers were affected across tens of thousands of restaurants. That number is not small, that's larger than the population of many American cities. When a policy touches that many workers at once, even small shifts have large consequences. Here comes the first uncomfortable question. If wages rise 25% overnight, where does that cost go? There are only a few places it can go. Prices go up, hours go down. Hiring slows, automation accelerates. Or stores close. That's not ideology, that's accounting. It's the most basic form of economic gravity. Supporters of the wage increase argue workers needed relief because living costs are brutal. That argument resonates. But critics argue the policy landed at the worst possible moment when restaurants were already dealing with inflation, supply costs, and weaker foot traffic in certain areas. That's why this isn't just a wage story. It's a timing story. It's an execution story. What's interesting is how quickly the labor market responded even before the law fully hit. Some franchises didn't wait to see how it played out. They ran the numbers early and started cutting costs ahead of time. That tells you they didn't see this as manageable, they saw it as existential. And yes, different studies have estimated different job impacts. But here's the bigger truth. The numbers vary, but the direction doesn't. Multiple analyses point to job reductions, slower growth, and a contraction compared to other states. Even research connected to pro-wage perspectives acknowledged losses. That matters because it signals something deeper. Even the people who support the policy had to admit it didn't land gently. Here's the part nobody wants to say plainly. A wage increase can be both morally defensible and economically disruptive. Those two things can be true at the same time. Politics hates nuance. Reality demands it. Let's talk about why California is uniquely vulnerable to this kind of policy shock. California already has high commercial rents, high energy costs, high regulatory complexity, and high insurance burdens. That means restaurant owners have less cushion than businesses in lower-cost states. A wage increase in a low-cost market might be absorbed. In a high-cost market, it can be the final weight that snaps the beam. Now zoom in on what happens inside the restaurant. When labor costs spike, the easiest adjustment isn't always to fire people. It's to reduce hours. That's the quiet version of job loss. It doesn't show up as a dramatic layoff headline, but it shows up in workers' weekly paychecks. If you make more per hour but get scheduled for fewer hours, your total earnings can shrink. That's the part that creates frustration because it feels like a raise that doesn't raise you. And when restaurants reduce hours, the job itself becomes harder. Fewer workers per shift means more stress, faster pace, less flexibility. Customers wait longer, workers burn out. Managers fight for staffing, everyone feels it. That the public usually blames the employees, not the structure. That's where trust erodes, not because people don't want workers paid more, but because the experience becomes worse and more expensive at the same time. Here's a pattern interrupt. Have you noticed how fast food doesn't feel fast anymore? Longer lines, fewer open registers, kiosks replacing people, delivery apps doing what restaurants used to do directly. That's not a coincidence, that's a business adapting to a new labor cost reality. It's not always evil, sometimes it's survival. Now we hit the pricing question. When executives say higher pricing is part of the solution, that's not corporate greed talking. That's cost pass-through, and consumers feel it immediately. Fast food has traditionally been the last refuge of the working budget quick meal, low cost, predictable. But if prices rise faster than the national average, and customers start realizing it's cheaper to eat at home, the industry loses its core advantage. That's when the model changes, and here is where Gavin Newsom's role becomes politically relevant. Not because he personally sets every price or closes every restaurant, but because California's governance model is now being judged through everyday pain points. When people can't afford what they used to afford, politics becomes personal. That's when policy debates stop being abstract and start living inside people's routines. It's not just Big Macs. It's the feeling of instability. It's the sense that the rules are changing faster than people can adapt. And that is the kind of pressure that builds quietly for years, before it explodes in an election. Midway through this story, it's worth saying something self-aware. If you're still watching, you're not here for outrage. You're here to understand how power and policy actually work, how good ideas can produce messy outcomes when reality pushes back. That's why serious viewers stick around. They don't want propaganda, they want the mechanism. So here's the real question: is California creating a better future for workers, or accelerating a transformation that ultimately reduces opportunity? Because both outcomes are possible. If wages rise and the industry adapts without collapse, workers win. But if adaptation means fewer jobs, fewer hours, and more automation, the question becomes, who truly benefits? This is why the wage increase isn't the final story. It's the opening chapter. The next chapter is automation. Kiosks aren't new, but they're expanding. AI scheduling tools are tightening shifts. Chains are testing smaller staffing models. Delivery platforms are absorbing labor functions that used to be inside the restaurant. The jobs are being redesigned, not eliminated entirely, but reshaped into something leaner and less secure. And here's where the politics gets complicated. Advocates will say higher wages forced companies to modernize and become more efficient. Critics will say higher wages accelerated a race to eliminate workers. Both narratives will compete. But the truth will show up in the labor market, in hours, in hiring, and in closures. Now let's talk about the closures themselves. Closures aren't always a sign of collapse. Sometimes they're consolidation. Weak locations die, strong locations survive. But even that is a warning, because consolidation means fewer options, less competition, and often higher prices. And when small-town locations close, it hits harder. Those are local jobs, local gathering points. Sometimes the only late-night option. When they disappear, communities feel the loss immediately. What makes this story powerful is the human side. Workers saying they'd rather have the old wage than no wage at all. That is the kind of sentence that rewrites a policy debate. It doesn't mean workers don't deserve better. It means the transition is hurting them in ways politicians didn't predict or didn't prioritize. And notice what franchise owners start doing when the math gets tight. They postpone upgrades, delay repairs, freeze hiring, cut hours, count every ingredient portion. When the manager is watching ketchup packets like a budget meeting, it tells you the business has moved from growth mode into survival mode. That is the exact moment an industry changes. Now, the most important part of this story is that it's not isolated to California. California is simply the biggest and most visible example. Other states are watching because wage policy is spreading. And if California's experiment creates visible pain and closures, it becomes a national talking point. That's why it matters beyond Gavin Newsom. This becomes a test case for the future of work in America. And it's also why the messaging war will intensify. Supporters will point to workers are earning more per hour. Critics will point to reduced hours, layoffs, closures, and inflation. Media outlets will cherry-pick whichever story fits their worldview, but the truth is in the combination. Higher wages plus higher prices plus fewer hours is not a clean victory. It's a trade-off. So what happens next? Here's where Act 3 becomes clear. California's fast food future will likely split into two worlds. High-volume locations in dense areas will survive, adapt, and automate. Marginal locations in smaller markets will struggle, shrink, or close. Workers who keep jobs might earn more per hour, but face more intensity and fewer hours. Customers will pay more, order less, and increasingly shift to home cooking or cheaper alternatives. That isn't the apocalypse, but it is transformation. And transformations always come with winners and losers. Politically, this is where the stakes rise. Because if fast food becomes expensive and unstable, it becomes a symbol. It becomes a story about affordability, about cost of living, about whether leadership understands everyday economics. And that's how Gavin Newsom's broader record gets judged, through the lens of what life feels like, not what policy papers promise. And the most dangerous part for any leader is this. Once a narrative forms that the math doesn't work anymore, it spreads to everything else: housing, energy, taxes, business climate. It becomes a general belief that the system is becoming unlivable. Whether that belief is fair or exaggerated, it's powerful. Because politics is often driven by perception as much as reality. So here's the ending question, and it matters. If California can't make the basic economy of fast food work smoothly under progressive policy, what does that say about larger, more complex systems: housing, infrastructure, healthcare? If the easiest industry to run is straining, what happens to the hardest ones? That's why this story isn't about burgers. It's about the future of work and the limits of policy ambition when it collides with cost structure. California isn't just raising wages, it's stress testing the economic model. And the results will be copied, criticized, and debated across the country. If you want to keep following this, the next piece of the puzzle is what happens when wage policy meets automation at scale, and how that changes the working class economy permanently. That's where this story gets even more serious, because once technology replaces hours, the debate isn't about wages anymore, it's about opportunity.